It's May the 8th, 1862, and the Texas Brigade is just coming off their first taste of battle. A victory the day before at Eltham's Landing. The brigade had suffered 40 casualties, including 15 killed. But there was no time to rest for the Texans. They were on the move again back towards Richmond. The Texans had not only proved that they could fight, but they were recognized publicly for their heroics from both President Jefferson Davis and Major General Gustavus Smith, who wrote that the Texans had won immortal honors for themselves, their state, and their commander. Three days later, on May the 11th, the brigade encamped under a grove of pine trees along the Mechanicsville Road about 3 miles from Richmond, a semi-permanent camp that they called Camp Pine Island. There, Colonel A.T. Rainey, commander of the 1st Texas, ordered the regiment to form under the colors. George A. Bernard was being promoted to color sergeant for the bravery he demonstrated during the Battle of Eltham's Landing, when after seeing the colors go down when Tom Nettles was wounded, George picked up the fallen colors and rallied the men. The brigade remained in camp until the 27th of May when they were called into action. The Battle of Seven Pines would be fought on May the 31st and June the 1st, but as Captain Tacitus Clay wrote to his wife back in Independence, Texas, they saw very little action. Clay also wrote that on May the 31st, Brigadier General Robert Hatton, commander of the Tennessee Brigade, was killed, and that Colonel James J. Archer, who'd been commanding the 5th Texas, and who the men had a dislike for, was promoted and given command of the Tennesseans. Lieutenant Colonel Jerome Robertson, who'd organized the Texas Aids, Company I, in Washington County, Texas, and was a friend of Clay's, was promoted to colonel and given command of the 5th Texas. The other casualty of the Battle of Seven Pines was General Joe Johnston, who was wounded by an exploding Union artillery shell and broke several ribs. Jefferson Davis, who'd had several run-ins with Johnston, assigned Robert E. Lee to take command of the Army in Northern Virginia. On June the 11th, the brigade received orders to join Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. In fact, Lee had devised a ruse to send the Texas Brigade and Whiting's Brigade to Stanton by train as a subterfuge to make Union spies believe he was reinforcing Jackson in order to attack Washington City. That would mean that Lincoln would have to hold troops back to defend the city, troops that couldn't reinforce McClellan. The brigade marched into Richmond and boarded the trains to Stanton, which they reached on June the 17th, excited about the prospects of joining Jackson. They still had no idea where they were headed when they got orders to return to Richmond. In fact, Jackson, the Georgians, and the Texans had been ordered to Richmond to take part in the next attack against McClellan's Union forces, the 7 Days Battle. By June the 25th, the brigade was in Ashland, about 16 miles north of Richmond, and the next morning they took up the march again to Hunley's Corner, north of Mechanicsville. Lee planned to use Stonewall Jackson's force, along with the Texas Brigade, to attack the rear of Porter's 5th Corps at Beaver Dam Creek, while Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and D.H. Hill attacked from Mechanicsville. But Jackson's delay in reaching the battlefield until late in the day meant that A.P. Hill attacked alone. After Porter's Federals held off the Confederate attacks at Beaver Dam Creek on the 26th of June, McClellan ordered Porter to fall back. McClellan's forces south of the Chickahominy were moving back towards the James River, and Porter was assigned as the rear guard. At dawn on June the 27th, Porter moved his corps to a new defensive position several miles southeast of a mill owned by William Gaines, to a plateau on Boatswain's Creek. Porter placed his men on the high ground around the Watt and Adams farms in an arc, giving them an advantageous position, and they immediately started building impromptu abatis, using fallen trees and brush. We're at the Gaines Mill National Battlefield, and we're standing on a crest just about where the 83rd Pennsylvania must have been dug in, facing Boatswain's Creek, which runs along the north side of the battlefield on my right. Behind me in the distance is the Watts Farm, which was General Porter's headquarters. Union artillery was placed all along the ridgeline, including Waterman's 18 guns, which were placed behind the farm on Turkey Hill. These fences represent the breastworks that the Union forces must have built as defensive positions against the Confederate attack. George McClellan had recently abandoned his supply route from White House and now had to move his wagons and cattle south. And he told Porter that it was imperative for him to hold this position until nightfall. Meanwhile, also on the morning of the 27th, when Lee saw that the Federals were moving south, he pushed his troops to pursuit. He met with Jackson at 9:30 in the morning and gave him orders to march around the Federal right flank and capture a key crossroads called Old Cold Harbor. Lee would use Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and D.H. Hill to sweep down the Chickahominy. A.P. Hill was supposed to pursue the enemy as far as Gaines Mill and New Cold Harbor, while D.H. Hill took the Bethesda Church Road and joined Jackson. But A.P. Hill would attack the Federal center at 2:30 in the afternoon and would be thrown back with heavy losses from artillery and musket fire. Longstreet saw how difficult it was going to be to attack across the Boatswain Swamp and decided to wait for Jackson to arrive. But D.H. Hill attacked the Federal right and was repulsed in another piecemeal effort. Jackson would once again arrive late to the battle. His local guide had misunderstood Jackson and was taking him to New Cold Harbor instead of Old Cold Harbor. Once the firing started at Gaines Mill, Jackson realized they were on the wrong road, backtracked to the north, and advanced down the right road, but the delay would put his 20,000 troops on the battlefield 3 hours late. With the leading elements of Jackson's column reaching the battlefield at 3 p.m., Lee ordered Ewell's 3 brigades to attack the Union center, and also directed Longstreet to attack the Federal left flank as a diversion. But both Ewell and Longstreet were repulsed. Because of the piecemeal nature of the attacks, even with a numerical advantage of 57,000 men to the Union's 34,000, Lee was still unable to break through. At this point, Lee made a decision that won the battle. He would use Hood's and Law's brigades as shock troops in one final desperate effort to break the enemy's center. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Lee rode out to find General Hood. He explained to Hood that unless the enemy's lines could be broken, the battle would be lost, and asked Hood, "Can you break the line?" To which Hood replied, "I will try." We're standing next to the Texas Monument at the Gaines Mill battleground. We're on the other side of Bosun's Creek, which is behind us. After Hood and Lee spoke on the afternoon of June the 27th, Hood formed his brigade in a line of battle, with Hampton's Legion on the left, the 5th Texas, the 1st Texas, the 18th Georgia, and the 4th Texas in reserve. Hood gave his men orders not to fire during the attack, not to break ranks, to give the first line of defense the bayonet, and when they fell back, to fire at the second line of defense. Hood checked his line, and at 7 p.m. the brigade advanced.
John Bell Hood was very attached to the 4th Texas. That was his old regiment. And he made a promise. He goes, the next time the 4th Texas goes into battle, I'll lead the regiment myself, and he did. He led the regiment at Gaines Mill. He was under fire. And it's a miracle he didn't get wounded or killed.
We're standing next to Bosun's Creek, looking back towards the advancing Texas Brigade. During the advance, Hood had noticed an open area to the right of the 18th Georgia and moved the 4th Texas up to fill the gap. The Texans were walking over the bodies of the fallen men from A.P. Hill's earlier attack, and men were still fleeing the front, urging the Texans not to go any farther or they'd be killed. Just on the other side of the creek, the brigade stopped. The lines were dressed, the order to fix bayonets was given, and with the order to charge, the Texas Brigade attacked. The Texans came out of Bosun's Creek and gave the Union first line of defense the bayonet. It fell back on the second and broke. The Federals fell back in a rout, with the Texans now firing and rarely missing their targets. At the top of the hill, the Union cannoneers stood by their guns bravely, but nothing could stop the inspired Texans. Hood had broken through. The 18th Georgia moved to the right and poured through the gap that the Texans had created, as did the 5th Texas and then the 1st. Soon the entire Confederate line was attacking and the Union 5th Corps was in retreat. The battle was won, but not without a heavy cost. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford Warwick of the 4th went down when he picked up the colors from one of the defeated regiments and shouted, "Come on!" Colonel John Marshall, who had replaced Hood as the commander of the 4th, was killed before the regiment reached the Union breastworks. In fact, all of the officers above the rank of captain in the 4th Texas were killed.
And there's a lot of the officers that were killed at Gaines Mill. John Marshall of the 4th Texas, who was the commanding officer of the 4th Texas, he was killed at Gaines Mill because he was on his horse and he was leading the regiment and he was shot off his saddle.
Val Giles writes later in his book that he was wounded and knocked out by grape shot before he could reach the crest of the hill, and a good Samaritan grabbed him by his collar and dragged him to safety behind an apple tree. Color Sergeant George Bernard of the 1st was also wounded. Carrying a massive flag, Bernard suffered a wound that left him lame in his left leg. But that didn't stop him. As he reached the Union abatis, Bernard threw the flag over the felled trees and crawled under them, picked up the flag, and waved it from the top of the Federal breastworks. Colonel A.T. Rainey, the commander of the 1st, was also severely wounded in the left hand and arm, and would later be sent back to Texas, never to serve again. Captain Tacitus Clay, the company commander of Company I of the 5th Texas, received 2 wounds during the attack. One wound to a leg, and the other bullet entering his side and lodged in his back. Taz was treated at a field hospital and then taken to a hospital in Richmond to recover. That night, as Hood rode over the battlefield looking for his dead and wounded, he heard his name being called over and over. He found Captain William P. Chambliss of the 5th U.S. Cavalry wounded on the field, calling his name. Hood and Chambliss were friends, having served together at Fort Mason in Texas before the war. Chambliss and the 5th had counterattacked late in the evening, trying to reclaim the artillery pieces that the Texans had captured, and were repulsed. Hood exchanged pleasantries and had Chambliss taken to the hospital and treated the same as his own men. The battle at Gaines Mill gave Robert E. Lee his first victory, but it came at a tremendous cost, with 1,483 killed and over 6,000 wounded. The Texas Brigade lost 89 killed and 476 wounded, most from the 4th Texas, who led the charge. By 4 a.m., what was left of Porter's Corps had escaped across the Chickahominy River, burning the bridges behind them. The Union loss at Gaines Mill unnerved George McClellan and caused him to give up his attack on Richmond. The Confederate capital was safe. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Hood's Texas Brigade, and if you did, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel.